and welcome to this virtual event. Nevertheless, she persisted, countering backlash to women's progress. I'm Elaine Verveer, the director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And this is the third conversation in a 5-part series, The Way Forward, Accelerating Progress for Women and Girls Around the World. We've organized this program in concert with the Georgetown Ambassadors for Women, Peace, and Security and the Rockefeller Foundation. The series is based on the groundbreaking report that we developed and published to mark the 25th anniversary of the UN Fourth World Conference on Women, in collaboration with the Rockefeller Foundation and with the participation of 25 global women leaders. The Beijing Plus 25 report charts a path forward to overcome some of the toughest barriers to gender equality, persisting barriers. And today we are seeing pushback to women's progress around the globe. The gains women have made are frequently at risk of being undermined, eroded, and rolled back by authoritarian leaders who appeal to traditional values and nationalism, as well as by other forces of opposition. Just a few days ago, Turkey's president, in a midnight decree, withdrew Turkey from the international treaty preventing violence against women, known as the Istanbul Convention. As the foreign minister of Sweden noted, this action is deeply regrettable. Combating violence against women with legally binding tools to prevent the abuse, protect women, and prosecute the perpetrators is more urgent than ever. Women leaders and public figures face threats and abuse online and off. Policies to penalize women are in vogue in many places. Rights to sexual and reproductive health are being contested, and women elected officials are increasingly targeted with violence. Being a woman in politics shouldn't come with a death threat, nor should being an empowered woman be a threat to your life. Yet growing numbers of states are attacking policies that support women's rights. How do we push back on the pushback? How do we more effectively use our power for purpose, use our voice, exercise our vote? How do we better organize, work with male allies? How can the multilateral organizations be more supportive and effective? We have a distinguished group of leaders, both from government and the grassroots level, with us today to grapple with these questions. Before we begin, I'm happy to welcome each and every one of you. About 1,000 folks are with us today, as well as countless more who are with us on Facebook. We already have received many pre-submitted questions from our audience, but you will also have an opportunity to submit questions to the speakers throughout the program. Use the Q&A feature on your screen, note your name, your organization, tell us to whom your question is addressed. I'm now delighted to turn to Michelle Bhatia, one of our Georgetown ambassadors for Women, Peace, and Security, and she is coming to us today from Singapore. Good evening, Michelle.
Thanks, Milan. The Georgetown Ambassadors for Women, Peace, and Security are a global community of women leaders from the private sector, academia, government, and NGO communities who are passionate about women's empowerment. Our mission is to amplify the impressive work of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. We know that peace and security and economic development are more effective when women are involved, and at the same time crucial for women to express our voices and achieve our potential. We are thrilled to collaborate on this series, which expands the audience of changemakers and provide concrete ways for each of us, wherever we live and whatever we do, can be part of the solution. Thank you for being here and for doing your part to advance women and girls. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks to the ambassadors for all you do. I'm going to turn now to Jenny Klugman, the Managing Director of the Institute. She leads our research portfolio and has served as the lead author of the report on which the series is based. Jenny, please give us a brief overview of the report contents that we're covering in our discussion today.
Thank you, Milan. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad to be able to briefly set the stage for today, and I'll spend the next few minutes highlighting and sharing some relevant points from our Beijing Plus 25 report, which we're happy to share in the chat and with you all. We have such an august panel today with rich and deep experience. I'm just going to provide an overview of how countering backlash to gender equality emerged as one of 5 key levers, as shown on this slide, alongside resetting gender norms, bridging gaps between law and practice, fostering accountability, and harnessing technology. And those indeed are the topics that have formed the series about which Milan Verveer has referred. These levers are closely connected, of course, and countering backlash is clearly critical. Indeed, by definition, central to sustaining progress on all fronts. Resistance can come from multiple sources, typically from men who benefit from the status quo, from ultra-religious and fundamentalist groups, as well as populist governments. Typically, their strategy involves misrepresenting and even demonizing different elements of the gender equality agenda as threats to traditional or to family values. We've even seen governments, including the US under the previous administration, stop using the term gender in official documents. Oftentimes, core aspects of gender equality are under attack, including women's sexual and reproductive rights, and especially the right to choose, and reversals of protection against violence, as we witnessed last week in Turkey. Sometimes backlash against gender equality is also linked to homophobia and assaults on the rights of LGBTQI people. And pushbacks against gender equality can range from denials of the issue to legislative repeals of progressive laws, and then range through more aggressive actions and even violent forms of repression that we'll hear about today. One very worrying form of backlash is political violence against women activists and political leaders, those demonstrating on the streets. And there have been increases in reports of such violence, including attacks on human rights defenders. And we've seen that these risks have worsened in a number of countries around the world, where the COVID crisis has operated to erode norms of justice and often polarized political discourse. Of course, progress on women's rights has never been linear, but there is a real sense that threats to progress have become more salient in recent years, possibly as a reaction to the hard-won gains that had been made by women's groups at the grassroots up through the global levels, and the major commitments that many national governments had made to gender equality. From our review of experience around the world that you can read in the report, rallying collective action to counter backlash to gender equality has been very important and can be very effective. The actions here included mass demonstrations and social media campaigns. One element of this strategy can raise awareness about how gender equality benefits everyone in society, not just women. Among the interesting country cases that we highlight in the report are Armenia and Malaysia. Armenia is interesting because in a very patriarchal society, landmark legislation had been adopted in 2013 on equal rights and opportunities for men and women. However, that law in turn met powerful backlash fueled by ultra-nationalist groups, which condemned the law for threatening traditional family values. And women's rights activists were harassed. In turn, this campaign was successfully countered by women's groups using social media as a megaphone. And a coalition to stop violence against women organized demonstrations, petitions, press conferences, and protests outside government buildings. And the efforts to repeal the law were successfully averted. So what we do in the report is look at successful efforts to counter backlash. We also saw that international agencies can play a role. I'm working now with UN Women's Rule of Law team, and it's interesting to see how their program of work has expanded beyond supporting new progressive laws to working hard to avert rollbacks. One recent example comes from Somalia, where conservative opposition to a 2018 bill criminalising sexual offences was manifested in an alternate bill that permitted child marriage and withdrawal of the progressive bill. What happened was that the progressive bill was withdrawn, the conservative bill was withdrawn. UN efforts was important in, and civil society were very important in mobilising to withdraw the conservative bill, and advocacy is now underway for reintroduction of the Equal Opportunities Bill. Of course, resistance to gender equality can occur at all levels, from international organisations and national arenas to the workplace. In Victoria, Australia, where I had the pleasure of advising Vic Health for several years, the agency has proposed several useful strategies, which we also outline in the report. Strategies that can be used by women every day in the workplace to navigate resistance, women and men, I should say, to navigate resistance in everyday conversations and interactions, including ways to identify allies, to recognise domination techniques in meetings and other fora, how to actively listen, and how to use dialogue and explanation and conversation. And I would commend their publication to you, which we'll share in the chat. So on this front, I'm also looking forward to hearing about the Me Too movement in China as a platform for resistance for workplace harassment. So without further ado, let me again encourage you to take a look at our report and turn back to Milan and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And now if I could call everybody's attention to this video before we get into our discussion.
Women's rights are under attack. We receive sexist threats on social media with little to no consequence. #MeToo and the term feminist are censored in China. Governments in Europe claim that anti-domestic violence legislation threatens family values. And politicians are exploiting backlash to gender equality to win votes. But around the world, women are holding the line. We are finding creative ways to mobilize in person and online.
We went viral in China. We occupied the men's room and claimed more room for women's restroom.
It scares people because women are standing up.
We're working to expand and adapt policies to protect women from online violence.
We would like to see online hate speech and all forms of online violence against women listed as a cybercrime.
We are pushing back against those who oppose women's rights legislation.
We are mandated to monitor implementation of women's human rights, and in doing so, we are pushing back those pushback movements.
And we're working within governments and institutions to expand policies to protect women everywhere. It will take all of us to keep women's rights moving forward, not backward. Through collective action, social media campaigns, and political will, we can mobilize our power, strengthen our visibility, and counter this backlash to gender equality with all our force. Because together,
we must push back against the pushback. We cannot give way. We refuse to lose the ground we have won.
And now to our opening speaker, Susana Malcorra, the former foreign minister of Argentina and currently the dean of the IE School of Global and Public Affairs in Madrid. Welcome, Susana. You have had a distinguished career at the UN. You're an expert on strengthening the multilateral system and its role in advancing progress for women and girls. You served as the Chief of Staff to former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and as the Undersecretary for Field Support and Peacekeeping Operations. And you've also had a career in the private sector. We're so grateful to you because you have been an integral contributor to the Beijing Plus 25 report, providing valuable and effective insights on how to counter resistance to gender equality. We're grateful to you for that, and we're grateful to your being with us today. So Susanna, in setting the stage for the panel discussion, perhaps you can speak to the backlash to gender equality at the global level and how that relates to the work of the United Nations, as well as your recommendations for countering the backlash. As long as I've known you, you've been worried about this backlash, and it seems to grow by the day. So we're pleased to have your insights and your recommendations in going forward. Please, Susanna, and welcome.
Thanks, Melan. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be hosted by you and by your team. It's great to see so many colleagues sitting around the screen, I should say. Today, I'm not only wearing my hat as Dean of the IE School of Global and Public Affairs, I'm also using the background of our group of women leaders, Voices for Change and Inclusion. You are part of that. It's a group of women that exactly see the issue that you have put forward to me. I mean, this association between the need to keep pushing on the question of women's rights and on gender, but at the same time, recognize that there is one platform that has been critical for moving this agenda, and that is the United Nations. We will not be here today where we are had not been for the UN and the different opportunities that the UN brought to bear in its existence, in its 75 years plus of existence. You know, the Convention for the Status of Women, CSW, is an essential part of what we do and how we move ahead with the matters related to women's rights. And this has been established within the UN system. We can speak about the different conferences that they had been called on women's issues, and all of them had been called within the framework of the UN system. So the first thing one needs to recognize is that what we have been able to achieve so far, in many ways, is due to the intervention of the UN system, and to something that I think is important to mention, which is the peer pressure that something that is decided within the UN system framework brings to governments throughout the world. The notion of going through an exam every time they meet and they have to measure how compliant or non-compliant they are with certain issues puts pressure that really moves the agenda forward. And I think that's what has allowed us to achieve what we have achieved. Having said all of this, and because of all of this, I can also attest to the fact that for the past quite a few years, and I would argue probably at least for the past 10 years, it could be even more than that, there has been a concerted effort within the system to push back on this agenda. It has, and this is not happening by chance, and I want to emphasize this. There is a coalition of groups of different nature. Sometimes you are surprised to see how diverse the nature of those groups is, but they come together to oppose and to find ways to push back on the advancement of this agenda. So since this is happening by design, I think we need to recognize its existence. The fact that CSW has not been able in the past few years to really move the needle in the issues that are at stake is a proof of that. There are components of the member states representation, I will put it like that have allied themselves to prevent from this moving forward. So what can we do about it? The first thing we have to do is talk about it, recognize it, recognize that we cannot be naive and think that this is just happening because of nature. No, there is a design here. As much as there is a design on many other fronts from a conservative perspective, this is a design. And it is a design that we have to fight back, no question about it. So recognize its existence. The second thing we have to do, I believe, is unite ourselves in ways that are as smart and as effective as the ones that this coalition has generated, so that we have a counter pushback of equivalent availability and of equivalent efficiency and effectiveness. We women work together often, but often not as closely together and as coordinated together as we should, and as these groups do in the multilateral system. And thirdly, I think we need to really call to task those who have not made progress at the government level, because policies are essential to transform life. They are not the only thing, but if you don't have the policies, you will not be able to advance the agenda. So we need to call to task and measure progress, and measuring progress is essential. We have to be able to say, these are the things that have worked here, here, and here. These are the things that are not working, and these are the things that have moved backwards. For that, your report on Beijing plus 25 has been essential. And while I wrap up this as a first intervention, I will add, Milan, and you have mentioned this, that is a sad moment when you see that Turkey has withdrawn from the Istanbul Convention. It has double significance because it's the convention that was adopted in Istanbul, Turkey. And it shows a contrast within the same country, how things can move so badly that they reverse a decision of support that Turkey hosted in its own capital. So I will argue that these forces are strong. They mean to really push back hard. They use messages that put the women's rights against family rights, which is just bad, but they do that, and through that they acquire more audience. And we have to stay absolutely strong in order to not cease on what we have achieved, but most importantly, in moving forward what is there to achieve, which is a lot.
Thank you so much, Susanna. You've really set the stage for our discussion. And listening to you, I was thinking back to the days when we were organizing the Beijing conference, the Fourth World Conference on Women, now 25 years ago. And even then, the opposition was saying it was about destroying the family. So these are tried and true methodologies, except that they seem to have picked up steam in many ways and are really part of a much more organized effort. And as you said, there are steps we need to now engage in. So thank you for laying those out. And I'm sure we're going to hear echoes of that from some of our panelists. So let me turn first to Dr. Dubravka Simanovic, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. Dubravka is also a member of the UNHCR Advisory Group on Gender, Forced Displacement, Protection, served as an expert on CEDAW, and as chair of the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. She was also head of the Human Rights Department at Croatia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and held several other posts in her government. And I might add, since the Istanbul Convention keeps coming up, that she was a negotiator in getting that convention together and ultimately put forward. Dubravka, first of all, thank you for being with us. I saw you recently speaking virtually at the United Nations on these topics. So you are very active and continue to be very active on these critical issues. At the UN, you talked about the pushback that we're discussing today against women's human rights standards. There are those who are claiming that anti-domestic violence legislation threatens so many issues such as the family or our, in some countries, our values, our cultural values. Now, you helped ensure the ratification of the Istanbul Convention against strong opposition in Croatia. So in addition to what you're doing on a global level, you've also been active in your own country, in your own government. Tell us, what were the approaches and strategies that you have found effective? What challenges did you face in Croatia, for example? How were you then able, not alone, obviously, in concert with others, to overcome those challenges? So help us understand from that perspective.
Melan, thank you very much for inviting me to participate at this important panel that is addressing pushbacks against women's rights in my capacity as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. And thank you for your question. But before going to reply specifically with respect to Croatia, let me mention that I see this pushback on women's rights as a global trend. And as a special rapporteur, in the past 2 years, I'm speaking before the CSW against those pushbacks. It is important to see that it is not happening only in Europe, what was already mentioned, but in different parts of the world. And as a special rapporteur, I have visited 10 states, produced country-specific reports, and in some of them, I have seen this pushback movement against the term gender, gender-based violence, misinterpretation of this terminology, and such things are stopping changes of constitution or other discriminatory laws related to women's rights in those countries. It is also important to see that during the Beijing conference, and I was a delegate of Croatia at that time, we had a extremely important recognition, these famous words of Miss Hillary Clinton, that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. But today we have challenged to have recognition of violence against women as a human rights violation. We have problems with recognition of women's right to life without violence around the world. So we do have problems with respect to pushing violence against women high at the UN agenda. And for that reason, we are seeing all those pushbacks. And let me turn back to Croatia and to some other countries, because I have also visited Bulgaria as a special rapporteur and produced country report. And in that country, ratification process was stopped because constitutional court was seek for advice from the parliament, and the constitutional court basically ruled that Istanbul Convention is not in line with Bulgarian constitution. So I have seen the situation in Croatia, and during discussions of the ratification, there were many misconceptions about the content of the convention. And what happened in Croatia, that after this first period, we had political will, we had prime minister who pushed for ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and then parliamentarians started to read what is the content. We had good discussion. I was also involved in this process, discussing what is the content, how this convention is connected with UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because basically it is codification of what we have achieved through the implementation of the UN Convention. And at the end, we had very good articles in newspapers and discussion in a parliament that showed that it is really possible through open discussion to see what is the main content of this convention. So I'm now hoping for Turkey that we will have that kind of discussion in the parliament with respect to the content of the convention. And as a special rapporteur, jointly with other independent expert mechanisms that are mandated to monitor situation of women and violence against women, we have issued a joint statement related to Turkey's withdrawal from Istanbul Convention, calling it pushback against women's rights. That is showing very dangerous signal that could now encourage perpetrators to see that they are not having any more obligations under the Istanbul Convention, also those services that are needed and so on. So we hope that, I hope, and the other mechanisms that joined that statement, that we will have reconsideration of this decision. And we are also seeing in Europe that other states are discussing ratification of the Istanbul Convention. I have just received information that Liechtenstein is going to ratify the Istanbul Convention. So there is a growing number of states that are seeing benefit of this convention and that are using convention to change laws, to change practices, to provide services that are needed. And we have to see that in Istanbul Convention, for the first time, we have definitions. What is due diligence? What is gender-based violence against women? We have definition of sexual violence and rape. We have so many important roadmaps that are needed here. And I hope that we will have a really pushback against those pushbacks. So as a special rapporteur, jointly with CEDAW and altogether 7 expert human rights mechanisms, we have issued a statement on pushbacks, those pushbacks by using our mechanisms better. So I hope that we are going to use momentum and really focus on implementation of all those great instruments that we have developed, starting from Beijing, but then developed further by global and regional human rights instruments that should be ratified and implemented. And here I would like to call also for universal ratification of CEDAW Convention, optional protocol to CEDAW, Belém do Pará Convention, Maputo Protocol, and Istanbul Convention, and focus on implementation.
So Dubravka, there are so many people listening in to this conversation. Yeah, you have mentioned the need to counter misinformation, that there's a purposeful mythology that develops about what is actually in a convention, for example, and we have to counter that with accuracy and join the debate. Are there other recommendations you would make to those who are listening in particular about how they deal with these kinds of forces of opposition in their own countries?
Thank you. You have mentioned that even during the Beijing conference and elaboration of the Beijing Platform for Action, there were similar attacks claiming that this is an attack to the family values and so on. So now we have to have a really open discussion, and we have to see how to use human rights perspective, human rights instruments, and human rights mechanisms in order to point out what are good practices, how countries have discussed all those issues, and what has changed with good collection of data, with good laws and good policies in this area. So as independent human rights mechanisms, it is 7 of us. We are now calling, for example, CSW to include us better in the deliberations that are done each year during the CSW, because it's not really visible what we as independent mechanisms are doing. For example, I was in 10 states. I have a concrete report with recommendations. I also have thematic reports on intersection between COVID and gender-based violence against women. They are both pandemics, but we do have vaccination now for COVID, and we have vaccination for gender-based violence against women that is really not used. All those instruments and Beijing Platform for Action are not implemented. So they should be used, but for that reason, we need to have more structured discussion. We need to say why efficient protection orders are needed, how they are stopping femicides, why we need shelters, why we need risk assessment. So we have to go deeper down. We should not stay only on gender mainstreaming rhetoric. We have to see concrete results, and we have to see data and how lives are improved at the end. So for that reason, we are calling for inclusion of CEDAW, my mandate, Gravio that is monitoring Istanbul Convention, also rapporteurs from Africa and Inter-American System, Working Group on Discriminatory Laws. We are calling all of us to be included in order to explain what we have seen in different countries, what recommendations we are putting forward, and how we are seeing that those recommendations are producing results. So with respect to Istanbul Convention, there is a lot of measures that I could recommend. I'm currently working on a report that will address rape as a human rights violation, and this disconnection between women, peace and security agenda and peace agenda, because now at the end, in all countries, you have one definition of rape, and that definition, should it be in line with ICC definition or in line with human rights instrument, for example, Istanbul Convention. So we have to see that if definitions are not there before the conflict, nothing is going to be resolved during the conflict. So there are many things that should be discussed from human rights perspective.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn now to Lian Xuan, a Chinese feminist activist, organizer, and lawyer who has played a key role in China's Me Too movement, persisting despite the crackdowns from the government, persisting to end sexual harassment and domestic violence, working to bring visibility to the women's movement in China. And also she's participated in many protests for gender equality, from unequal college admission policies to more public restroom facilities for women. She's currently a practicing attorney in New York and continues to be active on behalf of the grassroots women's organizing in China. So Xuan, it's really wonderful to have you with us today and to bring the perspective of what the women's movement has represented on this issue in particular in China. So tell us about how the Me Too movement has presented itself in China, what kind of crackdown the women's rights activists have had to endure. And is the term Me Too translated into Chinese? Is that banned or is that allowed? And I also know that one of the more progressive steps that has occurred in China recently, out of the kind of efforts that the women's movement has been making, has been the adoption of a violence against women law. How has it worked and is it enforced? So give us a perspective from your activism in China.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. So the Me Too movement in China started back in 2018, where a lot of young women, young professionals spoke up about their experiences of being sexually harassed by their supervisor in college, in the universities, or at the workplace. It started with individuals bravely, courageously speaking up in the public space and telling the public their stories. That was in 2018. And ever since people spoke up about their stories of being sexually harassed at workplace and at their universities by their supervisors, many young women and men are starting to pay more attention on this issue. And one of the collective efforts that were taken by young women in China, young feminist activists in China, was when a lot of these incidents were being seen on social media. People gathered, a lot of young people from different universities, they started to draft letters and urged their universities and the local educational departments to build a mechanism of anti-sexual harassment. This movement, this social media campaign, started off with individual stories, and then more and more people joined the effort to petition their universities and the local departments to build anti-sexual harassment. And more than 9,000 students or young women or men joined this effort, joined this campaign. And that was in 2018. More than 100 universities with a number of 9,000 students joined. And that was under the circumstances where offline rallies and demonstrations are very difficult or nearly impossible to organize. And after that collective effort, crackdown started. It mainly started when in March 2018, the Me Too hashtag was censored, and people got created by creating synonymous words that sound similar with Me Too in Chinese, which literally translated to rice bunny, and even that was censored. But people, I'm so sorry. People still persisted in talking about the Me Too movement and circulating all this information, even though the stories were deleted on social media and the mainstream media were banned from reporting this issue. So the only arena we had was social media. And even at that point, a lot of stories were deleted, or the social media company were using very advanced technology to prevent certain stories they use advanced technology or algorithm to prevent the stories from being circulated even more. But even under that circumstances, people, young women, read those stories and they were angry that those stories were not being seen. So they took the initiative to, even once stories were deleted, they would just repost it and keep reposting it and posting it everywhere they can see. And this was the efforts that people were taking. And yes, 2 years from 2018 in 2020, where we are in Me Too movement now. Since then, some young women are taking legal actions by suing their perpetrators, the sexual harasser, in court. And some of the women who were brave enough to tell their stories were being sued by the sexual harasser for defamation. And so far we have one and only one case that were won. The survivor won the case, and the court ordered the perpetrator to apologize in public. And the perpetrator is actually a social worker, and he's still a social worker, and he is holding power in a social worker organization. But still, he refused to apologize to this day. And this is where we are now. And there are two other cases or more cases where the young women who spoke up tried to use legal relief, but right now we're not seeing a lot of progress. We even saw in one decision where the judge said that it's a civil lawsuit, and the judge used words and very high standard of evidence, saying that we cannot find that there is beyond a reasonable doubt that sexual harassment happened, so we cannot say that it happens. So the person who spoke up may be involved in defamation, and that was a new decision that happened in late 2020. So basically, young women knew that there are just so many flaws in the implementation of our laws, and the judges don't have the basic idea of what the definition of sexual harassment is, and they're not understanding what young women are experiencing, and that is the result and the consequences that young women have to live with. And young women walk into this lawsuits, feminist activists, Me Too activists walk into those lawsuits voluntarily or involuntarily. They knew they might know what's going to happen, because that's not in our laws. That, like, the definition of sexual harassment is not in our laws. How to implement the mechanism, the anti-sexual harassment mechanism is not very well built, or it's not even established nationwide, and judges don't understand those ideas. So Me Too activists walk into those lawsuits knowing that the result might not be so good, but they are still doing it because they want to test. The result, the decision, the really bad decision is not that it does not discredit the Me Too movement in China. It's not like, a Me Too activist lost her lawsuit, and she was ruled that she has involved in defamation by speaking up. It's not like a decision like that does not discredit the Me Too movement in China. On the other hand, it is actually an evidence on how bad our laws are and how much our government needs to involve. And a lot of people are still working on that, and every step people are taking, they are also undergoing a lot of pressure. For example, a lot of Me Too activists who gathered in front of the court to support the lawsuits. Some of them were being harassed by the local police, and the supporters' families will be harassed by the local police or by the universities. And this is one of the tactics that the government is using. They know that by police approaching Me Too activists directly might not scare activists away, because activists know maybe that's what's going to happen. But right now the government is using their families as a scare tactic, because they know that we're young women, we respect our family, we don't want our parents to be worried about me. So that's what the government's tactics are, by harassing the activists' families, by forcing them out of their homes, by making their living situation really precarious, so that they cannot focus a lot on organizing efforts, both online or offline. And most importantly, a lot of feminist activists, feminist organizers, they're doing so much work to push for equal employment rights, or a lot of specific women's rights issues. They're organizing, they're building the movement, they're building the momentum in China. But when China passes the law, they will erase all the efforts of the grassroots feminist activists. The public cannot see the efforts that the organizers are taking on the ground, because what they did were never reported by the mainstream media, or even the state would just erase the news reports after 2 years or 3 years. So a lot of organizers, co-organizers, they cannot be seen, and the government is taking their credits for organizing and pushing forward and advocating. So that is some of the crackdowns, just one of the crackdowns that they're facing. And of course, we're so happy that after 20 or 30 years of advocacy, we finally have our anti-domestic violence law. And right now we're facing new challenges, because we don't really have a comprehensive supported system where domestic violence survivors can ask for help. For instance, we don't really have social workers. We don't really have a working shelter system where domestic violence survivors can seek help. And worst of all, under the circumstances, when domestic violence survivors cannot seek like resourceful help, they are also going through a very difficult legal procedure when they're seeking divorce. Like for a domestic violence survivor in China, they don't really have enough help. And when they want to divorce their husbands, right now, as of the first day of this year, they will have to go through a very long divorce procedure just to get away from their husband. And that the reason for that is because the country is seeing increased divorce rates. And instead of the increased divorce rates is actually a result for gender inequality, because women just don't want to get into marriages because there are so many. There are a lot of domestic violence. They're not protected by the laws. So women are reluctant to go into marriages. Women are reluctant to give birth to babies because it could affect their employment rights, the employment opportunities. But under that circumstances, the state is not solving those issues to increase women's rights in China. Instead, they're preventing women to be free from marriages. So that is something that I want to bring to this table.
Well, thank you for giving us that understanding of the difficulties. And I think if there's been any definition of persistence, you've just described it. And also how important it is to get laws, but to make sure the laws cover what they're intended to cover, and then that they operate effectively, and the work that needs to go on constantly in that process. So thank you so much, Shawan. I'm going to turn now to Asha Allen, who's the Policy and Campaigns Officer at the European Women's Lobby, where she specializes in advocacy and campaigns against violence against women. She also coordinates all the work on cyber violence and specializes in advocating and lobbying for gender equality within the EU and national level digital policies. She's project coordinator for the hashtag #HerNet, Prevent, Protect, and Promote campaign in cooperation with Google. So Asha, we have a lot of questions for you based on all of that. Thank you for being with us. You've been working on a number of initiatives to combat the rise of online violence against women and girls, which is linked to this broader trend that we've been discussing. So perhaps you can tell us a little more about the trends in online violence, how it relates to the broader pushback, how it can be addressed, and then especially about this campaign that you're coordinating on HerNet, Her Rights, which you use through the digital platforms and broader efforts. So give us a sense of how, since this is such a growing problem of online violence, what could be done to counteract it, and what recommendations you might have.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. For those of you who may not know us, the European Women's Lobby, we are the largest umbrella organisation of women's civil society in Europe, with over 2,000 member organisations. And I'll jump straight into the points that you were making. Online violence really is the 21st century iteration of the centuries-long violation of women's human rights that we've been seeing when it comes to violence against women and girls. The digital space really is a facilitator and a space of violence. So we see very specific forms of violence that have begun to appear online, whether this is image-based sexual abuse, more commonly referred to as revenge porn, but we use the term image-based sexual abuse, or looking at sexist hate speech, for example, or doxing, or just to go back to the very powerful intervention we just had, using that kind of online space in terms of intimidation against politically engaged young women and women across the board. And in terms of looking at it from the perspective of how it is a facilitator, understanding how much it's grown over the last few years, particularly the last 5 years, really ties into this mobilization around the opposition and backlash to women's rights that we've been seeing. Women and girls are 27 times more likely to be harassed online than men and boys. And for Black women, you are 84% more likely than that particular statistic to experience an abusive tweet or hate on social media. What we are seeing at international level and national level as well is increased recognition that digital tools are being used to perpetrate intimate partner violence. So this could be through coercion, control, using GPS technology for stalking. It is very clear how serious this is and how much it's part of the issue that we've been talking about, and that, of course, platforms such as Beijing have been talking about for many, many generations now. So, and looking at how during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing, how much this has increased and how much worse it has become. Some recent data from one of our close partners, GIWPS UK, highlights that this has increased maybe threefold for some people experiencing online violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. So really just wanted to reiterate that point in terms of how it's connected. I think one of the issues that we may see is this disconnection between the online and the offline space. But I think if we can accept that our economies are digitalized, so are our lives. And so acknowledging that it's one and the same and they blur between each other needs to be quite clear. In regards to the opposition that we're seeing and what we're talking about today, I'm glad that we're discussing the Istanbul Convention, because it is really at the crux of what we're seeing here. And I really want to pick up on the point that was made at the beginning in terms of talking about what's happening, acknowledging that this is a very coordinated, well-funded, sufficient movement to really roll back on women's rights. And we're already seeing that they're having impact. So it's also time for us now too to be able to mobilize to get the impact back and reclaim that space. And so the online space really has facilitated that mobilization. We have to be quite clear that that's what's been happening. We saw what happened in regards to Bulgaria and how they use social media and Facebook in particular to grow support amongst the general public who may not have known a lot about the convention or the provisions in the convention to grow opposition to it. And so the internet in itself, not to demonize it, of course, we're using it today to connect, to have this global conversation. And going back to the previous intervention, it's such a key tool for mobilization, particularly in a shrinking civil society space. The amazing work that the Me Too movement are being able to do in China and across the world is because we have these free tools and these free resources to be able to be used. But we need to be very clear that these spaces are not safe for women and girls and often being mobilized against them. And this includes the sexist hate speech against politically engaged women, human rights defenders, and how often that translates into offline violence as well. The European Institute of Gender Equality had recent data that showed that 51% of young women in Europe are now too hesitant to engage in political debate online because they are already aware of what they are likely to face if they do engage. So that's actually a rollback not just only on women's rights, but our democracies, the very foundation of participation and women's ability to participate in all the multiple facets of our societies. So just to touch upon our Her Net, Her Rights campaign, this was initially a report that started back in 2017. And what it set out to do was to map the prevalence of online violence against women and girls from a holistic perspective. So looking at sexist hate speech, but also looking at the various forms of violence that happen in the space, whether it was doxing or image-based sexual abuse, or how it is used to actually facilitate sexual exploitation, trafficking, elements like this. And what we were able to do in the years that followed after that report was to turn this into a campaign that aligned with our European elections campaign that happens every 4 years for the election of the European Parliament, where we were calling for parity in the European Parliament, but aligning it with a digital safety training and raising awareness about the online violence that the candidates were facing, that political engaged women were facing during the campaign. And that initial project turned into something a lot larger, and we were very proud of how far it was able to reach. And so our members have been been able to take that on to do those safety trainings at national level in their national languages, but also to go much further and have a much bigger impact in how the discussion on online violence is being manifested at European level. So we have a lot of support in the European Parliament and from a lot of our colleagues across civil society. And so for us, it's quite clear that then we need to see international standards and legal frameworks that combat all forms of violence against women, whether this is online or offline. We have some incredible standards at the moment. Many of them have already been mentioned, including CEDAW and the Istanbul Convention and some national legislations as well. But what we want to see is these being implemented effectively and the recognition of the online dimension within that, as many countries are beginning to do so. This is no more apparent than in the Istanbul Convention itself. It is at the moment the gold standard in terms of a framework on ending this huge violation of women's human rights. And in 2016, actually, the Council of Europe encouraged media companies and tech companies to participate because they recognized that they were an important stakeholder in ensuring that violence against women was eradicated. So just to echo, the decision of the President of Turkey is manifestly contrary to domestic law. Very strongly want to reiterate that first in terms of they've put forward this decision, but there is a process for the withdrawal and this has not proceeded from my understanding. And so there is an opportunity to push back on this, and we very strongly condemn this unilateral action that has happened and stand in solidarity with our sisters in Turkey who are going through this and who themselves have been on the front line demanding change, but they themselves have experienced a lot of online violence, a lot of harassment, and can talk and attest to precisely what I'm talking about today. So we would call for the full implementation and ratification of the Istanbul Convention by all EU member states and the EU itself, which signed the convention in 2017, and for this to be aligned with a comprehensive international framework where all the different pieces that we already have and the political will to move forward to bring those all together so that we have a global standard to protect women from violence against any form of violence that they may experience, whether this is online or offline.
Thank you so much, Asha, and for that. It's a snapshot, but a rather comprehensive snapshot. And of course, you know, it is the digital platform is one of those tools that has been very effective in helping to mobilize, but it's also doing enormous damage in terms of harassment and violence against women. So how to engage with it, and I think, excuse me, it's important in what you said. There is a role for government, a role for civil society, a role for the private sector, and we all need to come together in ways that make it more effective in the good that it does and obliterate the damage that is also being caused by it. So let's turn to our audience, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions based on what you've said. And we'll try to get in as many as we can. And unless they're directed to you as individuals, just let us know who wants to take which question. So I'm going to turn to Allie Smith now to tell us what we're hearing from our audience.
Sure, we'll do the first question which builds off the point you were just making on new coalitions and alliances to push back against the pushback. So it's asking specifically, what should they look like and who should be there? And then how do we formalize these new mechanisms for collaboration at the UN and elsewhere? And how should the private sector be formally included in this as well?
Who would like to grapple with that? Susanna?
Thank you, Melan. And I'm glad that the question was framed in a manner that is very inclusive, because that's exactly what we need. We need to bring different perspectives. We need to involve not only women, but also men who care about this issue, because that's the other thing that is important, not to misportray that this is all to be involved and care about. So that's one thing. The other thing is the private sector and the notion of the private sector being invested here. And I think that is another significant element. So they need to work very, very strongly to get their way into the United Nations, into ECOSOC. there are processes in which the civil society can be authorized to be part of these settings, these meetings. Very important to move. It's not easy to get through. That's one of the things that sometimes member states use, the blockage of access for civil society. But I think the more there is a concerted effort, the more they work together, the more they raise their voices, the more representation will be there of what the UN is all about, which is the peoples of the world.
You know, Susanna, you've had a long career that also includes the private sector, which you just mentioned. Are there more effective ways that we should be adopting private sector working with civil society, working with government?
Well, I think, first of all, the private sector needs to embrace the notion of sustainable societies, of sustainability in the broadest sense. It's not only an environmental perspective, which now is starting to sink, is a sustainable society in the most ample understanding, which includes issues like the gender question, women's questions. So the more the private sector understands that, the more we have a chance for the private sector to intervene in a proactive manner. I think we are not there yet, to be very honest with you, in Milan. I think the private sector has taken a very narrow perspective, and I don't want to generalize because there are some companies that have been more forward-leaning, but the private sector should be part of the solution. Governments have a lot to do, but once a government enacts a policy, most of the burden or the responsibility more than burden to move it forward will fall on the shoulders of the private sector. So they need to engage from the beginning, and they need to understand how significant this is. There are not sustainable companies in non-sustainable societies, and women's issues are central to sustainability.
Thank you. Asha.
Yeah, thank you. I really wanted to complement the comments that were being made here, particularly around the inclusion of the private sector, because looking at it from the online perspective, all the stakeholders need to be involved in order for us to resolve what's happening. There must be accountability and there must be responsibility by these platforms for what is being hosted on their platforms, essentially, which is the violence, which is the facilitation of this experience that women are having. And I want to go back to, again, the intervention around from Liang in regards to the algorithmic solutions. We tend to find that in this space that private companies are saying, you need to trust us, we know these models, we know how to conduct ourselves, and so we have these algorithmic solutions. And then you tend to find these algorithmic solutions often exacerbate the situation much worse, because they cannot pick up the nuances of human communication and how violence against women can be perpetrated and how women can be excluded from that space and how that can be translated into the offline space. So there needs to be much more transparency from them in regards to their how they moderate, but also what are their processes for eradicating violence, recognizing that they, as now a contributing social actor, because it cannot be looked at just in terms of they are an online platform. I think we recognize that the ability for people to mobilize, how large they are, how many people use their platforms, they are a social actor. And so they need to be engaged, and they need to be transparent, and they need to be accountable, both from a legislative perspective in terms of illegality, but also responsibility for what's happening in terms of harmful content, and to work with civil society to be able to do this, because civil society includes the experts who can point out where they may be going wrong as they go along the line.
Before we go to another question, Dubravka, do you want to make a comment on this as well?
Just a short one. I would like to go back to primary responsibility of state to prevent violence against women, to provide services for victims and to punish perpetrators, and to use this human rights perspective in in all the deliberations that we have at the UN level. And if you look currently at what is happening at CSW each year, we are having violence against women only every 5th or 6th year. And all those questions related to online violence, violence against women in politics, violence against women journalists, I have addressed in my reports, by the way. There are specific reports on those issues, but they are not at the agenda. So we have to see political participation each year when we are discussing position of women around the world. We have to see data on femicides. There are now a new way of collection of such data that is showing that out of, let's say, 10 persons killed in a context of intimate partner killings, more than 80% are women. So we need such homicide, femicide data. We need to have it each year discussed at the UN level in order to track progress, in order to see what are good practices and how we are pushing those pushback movements that are organized, that are coordinated, but we are not. So we should be better coordinated and organized. And mechanisms should be included in this process.
That's an excellent point. And I think really a lot of us need to take that data and make it more accessible to larger audiences. So it's not just in reports that, people may not even be aware of. Allie, do we have more questions? I'm sure we do. I shouldn't ask, do we have more?
Yes, we do. I'll put two here as our final questions. One from the Malala Fund, asking specifically about backlash in education and on teaching gender equitable values and behaviors, LGBTIQ rights, and comprehensive sexuality education. And then another one that I'm sure all of you have a perspective on, which is the role of individuals. A student asking, what can I do as an individual to advance gender equality, and what tools can I use to counter resistance in my private sphere?
Okay, let's go around on those. Who wants to start us off? Susanna, since you started today, can I turn to you first?
Thank you, Melan. Very briefly, I know we are running out of time. Education is a very big problem in this moment. And it's a bit even larger problem due to COVID. COVID has had an impact on education at large that is significant. There are parts of the world, my region, for example, Latin America, where education has moved backwards a few years, not a few months, a few years. So this is a significant problem, and this is a particular problem for girls. I mean, they are especially affected by this moving backwards. So it's education at large, which is a problem. It's the access to education, the right to basic education. On top of that, you add the additional comments that were made by the Malala Foundation on specific content in education, which of course is also part of the issue. As so, what to do on a personal basis? Everything. In the end, the difference is in our hands. And if we do not start as persons, as individuals, we'll never make it. Of course, then we have to associate ourselves. Then we need to become part of something larger, something bigger. But what we think, how we approach things, how we relate to others on an individual basis is the basic principle, the basic a piece of the puzzle that will transform things. So for the one who asks, everything is in your hand.
Asha?
Thank you. That was incredibly powerful. I don't have as much to add on to that, but I want to highlight that actually education was one of the first areas of opposition that we saw regarding the Istanbul Convention, which very clearly outlines that one of the ways that you can eradicate violence against women is to tackle the stereotypes that persist. And so I think it's quite clear that what we're seeing here in all those connections between the opposition to education, comprehensive sexuality education, and different rights is once again, it's all connected. And so I think this also goes to an answer in regards to all the different movements that can come together to work together to oppose this and to brainstorm and to really focus on bringing back that human rights approach and bringing back that human rights agenda, because essentially tearing down the patriarchy benefits us all. So I'll end with there and pass on to colleagues.
Sean?
I echo that everything in your hands can be used as your tools, and I would encourage people to organize or to speak up within your community, to get as much support as possible. If you can organize dialogues, conversations, please do. If you can speak up on your social media, post everything you can about the topics that you care about, because people can see. And if you are willing to do it, definitely act as a focal point of your friends, your peers, your surrounding, by being as high profile as possible to speak up about the issues that we care about.
Thank you so much. And Dubravka.
Thank you. Education is the key for prevention, and comprehensive sexuality education is opposed by many states around the world. I have visited Ecuador, and I have seen high rates of teenage pregnancy, and I have also seen 200 and something women in prison accused for abortions. So there are young women in prison, and they did not have proper education related to their reproductive rights. So I think it's a key that we progress with elaboration of what is in CEDAW, what is in Beijing on education, and target those things that are not in line with those commitments. It was mentioned that it is also in Istanbul Convention, but it is in all other instruments also, and we need to how to use those instruments to change such situations. And with respect to individuals, we are seeing now that women marches around the world, they are producing good results. With Ni Una Menos in Argentina and other states that followed, they showed that this movement is really pushing governments in right direction. So we need to join those movements. We need to speak up. We need to encourage those who are feeling that they have to message, that they should speak up. They need to speak up against violence. And situation is not same in different parts of the world. Many women are not following Me Too movement because environment is not there that will allow them to speak up. So we have to change it. We have to speak up more. We have to encourage women and men to speak up and to change all those forms of gender-based violence against women and girls that are persistent and that are at the level of the pandemic. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't think of a better question and set of answers to bring us to the end of this discussion. As has been said, every stakeholder has a role in this, has a stake in this. And none of us should shirk from our responsibilities. And I love what you said, Susanna. What does this have to do with each of us? Everything. And that is the note for us to go forward. And I want to thank Susanna Melchora, Dubravka Simanovic, Leanne Joanne, and Asha Allen. You've all brought a lot of wisdom, your experience, advice, insights to this discussion. I thank you for that, for making us smarter today, hopefully for inspiring us to do more, but also to thank you for what each of you does every day in trying to make the world a better place. So thank you for that. Our fourth program in this series will take place on April 22nd, at which time we will be looking at women's political participation and what more we can do in that area. This discussion will stay live on our website, so please feel free to go there for the reports we've been discussing, as well as telling any of your friends and others who might be interested that they can follow this in a delayed fashion. So with that, again, thank you to our audience, and we need to go forward, each and every one of us. So until next time, stay well and ever onward. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.